Hello and welcome to the Westcity Church podcast. If you'd like to get to know us more, find us at westcitychurch.com.au. We really hope that you're encouraged by today's message.
Ecclesiastes 3, 1-8. For everything there is a season, a time for every activity under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to harvest, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to cry and a time to laugh, a time to grieve and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to turn away, a time to search and a time to quit searching, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be quiet and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. My children and I have been coming to West City for almost 6 years now. And in that time, West City has experienced all kinds of seasons. We've had seasons of joy and abundance and happiness, and then we've also had seasons of grief and sadness and just really heavy. We've also had seasons of just neutral, where it's not good or it's not bad, it just is. And Ecclesiastes tells us that that's normal. And if you've been alive for even a small amount of time, you would have experienced that in your life. And when we are in a change or a season of joy and abundance, it's really easy to get on board with that. That's exciting. But sometimes we have changes that feel more like they're happening to us rather than with us. And in those seasons, one of the things I have learned in order to navigate that is to look for anchor points, to look for moments of grounding where I can just grasp onto that thing, things that don't really change. And here at West City, we have two of those points for me. One is the benediction. The benediction for me is the sum of a whole bunch of things that I believe and that are in my heart and at my core. And when I say those things, it's like a reminder to myself that this is who I am and this is what I stand for. And the other anchor point is the table. Everything that we do in a West City service leads to the table. I think sometimes people think because it's at the end that it's like tacked on, that it's an afterthought, but it's actually not an afterthought. Everything we do is leading to that because that is the height of our service. And one of the reasons why I feel it is the height of our service is because when we come to that table, that is when we get to join with Jesus in what's going on in our lives, individually, but also corporately. We all have times throughout our week where we can meet with Jesus, but there's something special about when we all stop and say, we're going to meet with him right now. And whatever season that you are in at the moment, I just really want to encourage you later when we come to the table that is your opportunity to meet with him. That's your opportunity to be still and know that he is God.
I just can't teach without it, that's all. Good morning, church. We are in the midst of a series called The Greatest Story Ever Told, and it's about this book that I'm holding in my hands, the Bible. And historians the world over would agree that this text, this group of scrolls of books that have kind of been smashed together, that were written by many people over many years, has had the greatest impact on the world compared to any other written text ever. So it's the most influential story ever told. If you look at statistics of how many books are printed every year, this is the most common book in the world. You'll find one in many houses, even if it's never been opened. And I think anybody who's ever sat down and tried to read it might agree that it's probably the most difficult text that you're ever going to try and wrap your heads around, especially the Old Testament, because we are not the original audience. We are not ancient Israelites in the ancient Near East. We do not have a working knowledge of the history, of the geopolitical factors, and it was written by people who didn't take us into account. They didn't think thousands of years ahead and think, oh, maybe we should explain the context a little bit and set this up so that modern readers who speak English and not our ancient languages can get their heads around it. So it is the greatest story ever told, but we've been going through this series and trying to address it chunk by chunk. And I'm taking the last chunk of the Old Testament, and I'm going to talk about a little story called The Exile and Return. You may have heard of it. I had heard of it growing up. I'd heard little bits and pieces, but I actually didn't think it was a particularly important part of the Bible until recently. I kind of, even when my husband and I went and studied at Bible college in our, when we were newly married and we did Old Testament history and things, I pretty much thought that Exile and Return was a kind of historical event that affects the timeline of the Bible. Like if you're trying to read this all this complicated stuff and take into account where you are in the timeline, there's things that happen before the exile, things that happen after the exile. But it wasn't one of the kind of foundational stories that shaped the theology of the Bible or anything like that. So I was quite surprised recently to hear some historians, people who don't believe in the Bible, people who are not Bible scholars, not even interested really in the storyline itself, who think that the exile and return, when the small, insignificant kingdom of Judah was taken away by the big superpower Babylon for a couple of generations and then returned, I heard a couple of historians who say that might have been the most important historical event in all of human history. That kind of bewildered me a little bit or intrigued me. And their point was that event, that crisis, that shifting of this people group and their cultural identity was the spark that got them writing. And in the time of the exile and beyond, and the next 100 years, the writing that came out of that people group, that story that shaped the story then that Jesus understood that he was a part of, has led to this document that has such an impact, not just on our lives as Christians, but actually culturally, the entire world as we know it. So, I want to talk you through that story of the exile and return. And we will have a little look first at the story, but then think about how that has impacted the writing of the Bible, but also shaped the storyline of the Bible from the opening pages right through to the closing pages of the document, and see if how that has shaped actually our theology. So it all happened a very long time ago. We're talking 600 years before Jesus was born, and you've got this period of time where there's the kingdom of Judah, and then they're taken away to the land of Babylon. They live there for a few years, and then they come back. So it's the exile and return. But to really have context for this story, we need to step back even further in history to about 1,000 years before Jesus lived. And Chin, can I do a shout out to Chin? Chin did a fantastic sermon a couple of weeks ago. If you weren't there to hear it, listen back to it, because he went into a lot of detail about this period of time that I'm going to talk about. And this is the time of King David. So I'm going to start by drawing a little crown for the great King David. And David was a shepherd, and he was a king, a man after God's heart. So every generation after looked back at David, and God made a covenant, an agreement with David that one of his sons would be on the throne forever. And David captured a city called Jerusalem. So I'm drawing a little city. Excuse my terrible art, but that's meant to be the city walls. Now, in ancient times, you didn't really have nations. You had cities, basically. You had city-states. So the city of Jerusalem had strong protective walls around it, and it provided security and protection for all the towns around it. So actually the population of this area wasn't particularly huge, probably like about the size of Bunbury or something like that, and within the city itself even smaller, so only, 15,000, 20,000 people or something that lived there, but the city of Jerusalem was their home. So they've got a king, they've got a city, and then David's son actually built a house for God's name. We call it the temple, and it's attributed to Solomon, but the books of Chronicles make sure that we know that it really came from David. The planning, the provision for it, everything. So it was David's, hope and dream to create this house for God's name, the temple. They often called it the house for short. And this was the religious system. This was the place where you could come and draw near to your God. And their God was called Yahweh. He was an invisible God. They couldn't see him, but they could enter his presence. They could draw close to him through the rituals of this temple worship system, which was run by the priests, who were then providing that identity, that connection to their God. And something that was particularly special about David's time was that this was the only period of time that the 12 tribes were united together in one kingdom. And that unity was so important. It only lasted David's reign and Solomon's reign after him, but everyone always looked back on that time where there was unity between the brothers, where there was reconciliation between them. And these are the things that created the cultural identity for this people group. They had a king, they had a city, they had a temple, a god, a worship system, and they had unity between the brothers, between the tribes. Did they have a Bible? Not really. They had bits and pieces. They had songs. So the most ancient parts of the scriptures as we know them are songs, because songs are the things that stick in your head and you pass on from generation to generation. They had stories. They had history books. They actually kept, like all cultures do, detailed accounts of their history as far back as they could go. But those aren't the history books that we receive in the Bible. So they had bits and pieces, but they actually didn't need a Bible because they had a cultural identity and a worship system, and the average person didn't read anyway, and they didn't need scriptures. Scriptures is something that we think of as really important to religious life, but in the ancient Near East, nobody had anything that kind of resembles what we think of as the Bible. And there's a verse in 1 Kings chapter 4, I think, and here it is. During Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, lived in safety, everyone under their own vine and under their own fig tree. So Judah is the 2 tribes to the south, that's Judah and Benjamin. Israel is the 10 tribes in the north. And for this brief period of time, under David and Solomon, those 2 kingdoms were united. And see how the imagery is all this garden paradise. Everyone lived at peace. Everyone lived under their own vine and under their own fig tree. I mean, you and I don't really want to go out and live under a vine or a fig tree, but they were talking, this is garden paradise. This was the peak. This was the golden age. This was the time that every generation looked back to and longed for. This was home. Now, the cracks started to appear pretty quickly, as they usually do, and straight away after Solomon, his son Rehoboam, were actually under Solomon himself. Solomon started to abuse the people and use them as slave labour and live as kings do to satisfy his own desires. And so he actually set the nation up for conflict, and very, very quickly you had separation of the 2 groups. And so you had 10 tribes to the north who were called Israel, and Israel no longer had a Davidic king. They no longer had a king from the line of David. The kingdom of Israel no longer had Jerusalem as its main city. They had Samaria as their city. They no longer came to the temple of the Lord. They put 2 temples, one at the top and one at the bottom of the country, with a golden calf in each one. So they were worshipping, they still called it Yahweh, but they really started to introduce all the practices of their Canaanite neighbours. Now, there are tender ears in the room, so I don't actually want to go into detail about the practices of their Canaanite neighbours and the religious kind of rituals that were involved in that, but they were gross and graphic, and none of us would really have the stomach to think about how that kind of impacted the worship of Yahweh. And so you start to get this breakdown straight away. But in Judah, to the south, they still have a king of David. They still have Jerusalem as their city. They still have the temple of the Lord. And they still have a cohesive cultural identity as the people of God. Now, in the background while all this is happening, and over the years, I'll move to the next slide, and I want to show you a map, because it's to think about the geopolitical environment that Israel was in. I want you to understand that Israel is a tiny strip of land, continues to be a tiny strip of land surrounded by massive superpowers. And back at that time, it was the land bridge between Egypt and Babylon, and the empires were starting to rise. So in about the 900s BC, Assyria became the first real empire in all of human history. They developed the kind of superpower, military might and things that empires require, and they just systematically went through, and they would come through a city-state, because they weren't really nations, they were just groups of people surrounding a city, and they could just annihilate them. They could just siege their city, didn't matter how big the walls were, and what they would do is they would depopulate the area. So they'd take the people, because empires are all about land, people and wealth. They just want your land, people and wealth. They don't actually want to come and harm you. They just want everything you have, including your people, and they want to assimilate it and grab it and make it part of theirs. So in 722, Israel, the 10 tribes to the north, got wiped out by Assyria. Now, we don't actually know how many people actually died in that. Did they die? Did they just get assimilated? Did they just get scattered and relocated to different places? But effectively, their culture, their identity, their position as a group of people was over, never to be heard of again in all history. And that was an everyday occurrence for people groups in the ancient Near East. That's what happened. That's why we don't have all these various people groups and identities still today, most of them. But Judah, to the south, still had a Davidic king. They still had a city, they still had a temple and an identity. And when Assyria came and tried to take over Jerusalem, somehow miraculously, they didn't fall. The Bible's got a whole story about that. Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, he wrote his history and made himself sound really good. We don't actually know why they left, but the miracle was that they did leave. They left intact. Jerusalem at this point was then under Assyria. They had to pay taxes to them. They technically belonged to Assyria, but they still had a cohesive cultural identity. There was no crisis of who they were. However, as you read the stories in 1 Kings, 2 Kings, and in Chronicles, you find out that over the next 120 years, the kingdom of Judah made a lot of political mistakes, because if you see this map, you can see that they're between Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon. 3 superpowers who are all rising and falling and all kind of battling with each other. And over again, Judah kept backing the loser. They kept making political alliances and going, oh, Egypt will protect us. Oh, let's go with Assyria this time. Oh, let's go with Babylon this time. And they would quite often pick the wrong one. And in about 600 years before Jesus, Babylon had risen to the most powerful position. And Babylon swept through on its way to attack Egypt, and it just kind of happened to attack Jerusalem on the way. And it had no real interest in destroying Jerusalem at all, so it basically just sieged them, took over the city, made them vassals of Babylon. They took away their king and his family and the elites, and they took them all to Babylon. They took away all their wealth from their city and from their temple, but they effectively left Jerusalem intact at that point. So Jerusalem's just had a traumatic event, but Babylon has installed a Davidic king. They've still got the city is intact, they've still got their temple, and they still have an identity as a people. So even though it's traumatic, it's not that bad. Until their king, Zedekiah, decided that he was going to rebel against Babylon for some reason. He thought that Egypt will back him. He thought that all the other little city-states around might join him. And Babylon, in the year 586 BC, decided that that would not do, and they needed to make an example of this upstart city-state. And they came and laid siege to Jerusalem for 1.5 years. And it was a scene of utter destruction and sadness and devastation. There was starvation, there was cannibalism, there were people having to eat their young to survive. There was horrible scenes. And this is the stuff in the prophets. This is the book of Lamentations. This is the dark, traumatic story of the exile. And then they basically smashed up those city walls, ripped them down. And they set fire to the temple and completely destroyed Solomon's beautiful temple. And they dragged these people away. And the king, they killed his sons in front of him so that his line would be ended forever, and then gouged his eyes out and took him off as a prisoner to Babylon. So you've got this huge cultural trauma, huge. This is the kind of thing that nations, that identity is swept away. They no longer have a king, so they have no leader. They no longer have a city to call home and walls to protect them. They no longer have a God, essentially. If the temple is gone, if that physical reassurance of his presence, if those rituals where you come to that place are gone, does your God even exist anymore? And they themselves had no identity. They no longer were the kingdom of Judah. They were just exiles in a strange land. And they were taken east. I'm going to put east here because that's an important word. And they were taken to Babylon. That's my attempt at a ziggurat, which is like the the kind of towers that they built in Babylon. And this was the crisis that made them change their identity. Until now, they were actually quite happy going along, just being a people group who had their identity wrapped up in these things. When these things were taken away, their identity shifted, and they started to meditate on the stories that they had, on the documents that they took with them, on the songs that they knew, on all of these things. And this was the beginning of this rich time of writing, where the scribes, where the prophets started writing. Some of them would write as individuals. Some of them wrote collectively. Some of them stitched together the narratives that they had and added to them. And as they were in Babylon, they were getting the best education in the world. They were in the most cosmopolitan place. This was where the melting pot of all cultures and languages and civilizations was coming together. And so you actually see some of the Babylonian stories coming in and influencing their writing at that time. And they had questions. They had questions about, who are we as a people? Where did we come from? Who is our God? What is he like? How did we get here? And will God ever deal with Babylon? And so the writings that we read in the Old Testament are complex ways of wrestling with those thoughts. And there's multiple voices, as Chin pointed out. There's many angles. There's a development over time of a theology. And there's these symbols just richly throughout everything. So that over time, they started to tell the story of where they came from. And they were exiles, in exile away from their homeland. And the Bible starts with a story of a garden paradise with humanity in relationship with each other and close to God and having a home and under the kingship of God. And then the great fall, where they go progressively east as humans choose their own ways that lead towards Babylon. The symbol, Babylon becomes a symbol of everything that humans do in collaboration, which causes oppression. So Genesis begins with a garden paradise, and Genesis 11 ends with the Tower of Babel, which literally is Babylon. It's the word Bavel means both Babel and Babylon, and the scattering of the people. And so you see that the whole earth, all of humanity, is pictured as exiles away from their true homeland, wanting to come back. And then Genesis 12 tells us the story of a man called Abraham, who's called out of Babylon to a land of garden paradise to begin a family. And then his family and their decisions lead to Egypt, which is another form of Babylon. And then Moses brings the people out, and through the books of Moses and then the book of Joshua, they come into the land which is a garden paradise. And then the book of Judges shows us again and again how they swing backwards and forwards, and they need a king. And then the books of Samuel and Kings tell us about that king, David, who brings them into that time, and then the fall towards Babylon. And so you've got this constant backwards and forwards of these things. You've got these images in their poetry. You've got this, and over and above that, the prophets start to have a hope, because eventually they do get to return from Babylon. They've got this longing for their homeland. And if you've ever been on holidays for a long time and you start to long for home, have you ever had that feeling? And then you get home and it's not as great as you thought it was? That sense of disappointment is a really big part of this story. Because they do get to go home and it's not like it used to be. And the temple that they managed to hobble together is, some of them celebrate when they see it, some of them weep because they remember what Solomon's temple was like. The walls that they put together are so flimsy that their enemies say even if a fox breathed on that, they could tip it over. It's kind of like the Three Little Pigs story. So they're disappointed. They know that, and the 12 tribes will never be again. And so they've got this deep sense of loss. Even though they're back, they're still exiles. Now, for us as Christians, if Jesus had never come along, this story would not have even registered on our radar. We wouldn't be interested in it. It would be a very weird piece of ancient literature that may not even have come fully intact in its current form through to today. But when Jesus came, he lived and breathed this stuff. He knew these scriptures inside out. And the New Testament writers make sure that they connect every aspect of Jesus to these stories. And so Matthew chapter 1 opens with a genealogy so that we know that this is the seed of David, that this is the king that we've been waiting for to re-establish the Davidic line on the throne. And he calls 12 disciples. He gathers the tribes back together, the reconciliation of brothers, which is just the beginning of the reconciliation of all humanity. And he becomes the temple. And there's a whole heap of imagery connecting him to being the new temple and then bathing us in the ordination so that we, as his followers, become the temple on earth. And the scriptures finish with that weird and wonderful book of Revelation where there's this ultimate showdown between Jerusalem and Babylon and the nations of the earth and these empire structures which cause oppression and evil in our world. There is a hope that one day God will deal with all of that and there will be a great Jerusalem that all the world is invited to. And it's not the physical Jerusalem, which is not a place of peace at the moment. It is the spiritual Jerusalem. It is the light for all the nations, the hope for all the earth. So it's a weird story, isn't it? But the exile and return, I had never realised how deeply and profoundly it has shaped the theology of the whole Bible. And that even today, we are exiles. We're living as exiles in this world. We're in a home that is not our home. Now, I'll put one more verse up on the screen. And this is a message that Jeremiah the prophet, it's a letter that he sent to the exiles when they were in Babylon. Because when you're in exile, you've got a couple of options. You can rebel violently against your oppressors and try and throw them off. Or you can submit and assimilate and become just like them. And a lot of Jewish people did. When the return happened, a lot of people went, no, we've lived for 2 generations in Babylon and we're doing really well here, thank you very much. We're not going back to that backwater. So you can rebel or you can assimilate. But Jeremiah says there is another way. Build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce, marry and have sons and daughters, find wives for your sons, give your daughters in marriage so they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number while you're there, do not decrease. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I've carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. And the people wanted to rise up and revolt, but the prophets called them to a subversive difference. Live differently from the people around you. Bring the joy of Jerusalem. Bring heaven to earth while you live in this place. Know that you are a foreigner and an outsider and an exile, but don't attack the people around you. Don't condemn them. Don't fight the systems that you're part of. Look for peaceful ways where you can shine as a light and be different, so you're not fully assimilating, but you're also not rebelling and bringing violence to that space. So the New Testament authors pick that up and they call us exiles and foreigners, people living in a strange land, longing for home, longing to bring that sense of home to where we live. So we're going to finish off today, as we always do, with the table. And as I was thinking about this sermon, I think the table fits in really well, because is anybody here from an immigrant family who have, cultural roots overseas? And you know that when immigrant families get together, they love to eat, because the flavours and the food, it brings back all the memories of home. It brings back all of that cultural identity, and we do so much around the table. And I love hanging out I love having friends who are recent immigrants and they cook me up, the most amazing food. And it makes me long for their homeland as well. And as we come and have the bread and the wine, which are the symbols of covenant, let's just think of ourselves as being foreigners and exiles who gather together regularly to eat the food of our homeland and to share in that hope together. So I'll ask the musicians and the helpers to come up the front, because this is the table, not of the church, but of the Lord. And it has been made ready for all of you and for all of us as exiles to share in together the food of our homeland. So come, you who come here often and you who come for the very first time, you who... Yes. You who have tried to follow and you who have failed, you who have much faith and you who have little. That was the bit that threw me. Come, because it is the Lord who invites you. It is God's will that those who want Christ should meet him here. Come.
Thank you so much for joining us. Each week at West City, we say a benediction together. We do this because we believe that the purpose of the church is to be a caring community for the world, and that as we go and serve others, we enter into Christ's work of welcome, restoration and healing, both for us and others. We believe that in doing so, we get to see and encounter Christ. So let's say the benediction together. We come together as the church to be reminded of the go of Christ. So we will go out and feed the hungry, go out and clothe the naked, go out and fight for justice, go out and end oppression, go out and proclaim anew the old story, go out and associate with those who don't look like us, think like us, act like us, and don't even like us. And we'll do it all in the name of the one who sent us. His name is Jesus.